the reason I really enjoy these is the discussion that comes out of these. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I've really enjoyed the previous two we've done. So that's going to be hopefully what'll happen this evening as well, because I think that's just really critical to how we to approach the subject. Tonight, as you notice, sexy title of industrial policy. And I'm going to do is I'm going to open up with a couple of slides, some definitions. We get past that. And then I'm going to ask you guys to help me answer the question. And I'm going to go through a bunch of questions tonight. But the first one I'd like to ask you is, have we ever had an industrial policy? I mean, it's a fascinating question. So I'd be interested in hearing what your approach to that question is. And then I would like to go back, and I'm going to be sharing screen and stopping sharing. So this is going to be an interesting exercise in dexterity. Hopefully it'll work. But then I would like to go back to take a look at what President Biden and his administration are proposing for industrial policy for the United States. And how do they define that? What areas are they particularly interested in it? But then I would really love your feedback on, given what I've just told you about what the Biden administration wants to do. I think what would be interesting is, what do you think is the reasoning behind that? What do you think is driving that kind of a program? I think I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that area. And then also I'd like to know what you think of what's the domestic political situation? What is this industrial policy even going to happen given the domestic political situation we have right now? And I'd appreciate, again, your thoughts on that. And then finally, which I think is really the most interesting thing, is if we do adopt an industrial policy as described by President Biden, what will be the consequences? I think that's really, really an important thing to grasp out of all this. So I'd love your feedback on all of those three questions, and I'll repeat them all so we won't lose track of what I'm thinking and what I'd like to have us talk about. And then finally, I'd like to return to another topic which related, which a couple of you have already mentioned, and that is, to me, we're in a really significant period of history for global affairs. And I think I could add a second subject to this talk tonight, which is the end of globalization. I think that's a really one aspect. If you're thinking about an industrial policy for the United States, does that mean something more fundamental has changed in the global environment and that we're reacting to that? I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that. So what is the future of globalization in view of this policy that we have now? And then finally, I'd like to just conclude with some final thoughts on what you think, where you think we might go next with this. And I have one final picture that I took on Peaks Island to show you how Peaks Island is approaching the issue of, well, I guess you could say industrial policy and globalization. So let me get started, and I'm going to share my screen and hopefully launch my very elaborate PowerPoint presentation. Now, this is going to be a technological challenge, so here we go. And by the way, as we do this, I would love it if you guys just, don't hesitate to interrupt whatever you need. If you need to find out more information, please feel free to ask questions. I think that would be great. I would much appreciate your doing that. And I'm going to move things, or I'm going to open up a PowerPoint and move some things around a little bit and close that up a bit. Okay. And I'm going to go to a slideshow presentation. So far, I'm hoping you guys are seeing this. Is it coming through? Okay. So are you seeing that? That's
yes.
A big one.
Yes,
okay.
Bill. Yes, we are.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm glad to hear that. We've passed the first test. So again, the title of this is the U.S. Industrial Policy, or the End of Globalization. And that very nice abstract art that you're seeing there on the right is actually a chip. And this is a chip from 1990. And they've become much more sophisticated, but the artwork, I think, is incredible. So I'm going to go back one. So we're going to go back to that, and then we're going to open up with some definitions. And industrial policy, and this gets tricky, by the way. I really had trouble nailing this down, even though I ran across several definitions, including in our reading, the reading we had from the Foreign Policy Association booklet on industrial policy. But I'm saying that I kind of tinkered around with it, came up with this definition. It's a deliberate, concentrated, government-directed application of resources to selected economic sectors to achieve economic growth and national security. So that is you can take it or leave it. There are all kinds of definitions of industrial policy. And sometimes they try to break it down by, actual production. So a lot of definitions I see on industrial policy really do refer to producing something tangible, where others refer to industrial policy and maybe it's not a tangible object. Maybe industrial policy is building a particular industry. Maybe it's financial, for example, where it's not a tangible product that you're going to see and feel and touch, but it's an important economic sector. So that's kind of a broad definition there. And I think with industrial policy, you can go just about anywhere. Globalization, on the other hand, and I think the two are very much connected. Globalization is the interdependence of the world's economies. It really, big interdependence is really a key word there. And it's brought about by the cross-border flow of goods and services, technology, investment, people, and information. And globalization, and I'll talk more about that as we get toward the end of the presentation, just to see, well, where are we going with globalization right now? And how is that connected with the industrial policy that the Biden administration is pursuing? So my very first question of the evening is, has the United States ever had an industrial policy? And I'd be very interested, and I'm going to stop sharing at this point and just go into that question a little more. And I'd be very interested in hearing what your thoughts are on that question. Have we ever had an industrial policy before? Could you describe it? And would you, if you want to, feel free to comment about its effects. Was it successful? Not successful? What results did it achieve? So again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, have we ever had an industrial policy? And I'm opening it up for discussion at this point. Would anybody love to just jump in on that one? Oh, well, yes, go ahead, Bob.
I think basically it's been a laissez-faire policy. That they let the markets determine most of it, and the government has had a small portion of it, but they put in a certain amount of investment into research and so on. But that's generally limited to that. I would just submit. Yeah, interesting comment. And Allison, you want me to call on people, or are you gonna, how would you like to do that?
I can call on people. Okay, so I think it was Landis, and then Don and Karen, and then Lila. So go ahead, Landis.
In World War II, we certainly did. And to my understanding, I wasn't,
Agreed.
well, I was alive in part of it, but I didn't remember it very well. But I don't think we have had anything significant since then. But we certainly did then.
Interesting comment. Other thoughts?
John and Karen?
Yeah. You hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
Yep. I just remember in maybe it was the early 70s that there was a real Buy American philosophy going on. If you even looked at a foreign car that was un-American.
Yeah. Interesting.
So I'm not sure if it was the government that pushed that, or just were people on their own taking that.
Lila?
Yeah, are you? Am I with you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Landis's comment about the Second World War. It's unequivocally in my mind an industrial policy for security, for managing the war effort. I think there might have been some elements of that even during our brief period of the end of the First World War. I'm wondering if some of Roosevelt's policies, which were focused on employment, might be, and human resources might be included. But what I was mystified by in the World Affairs Council piece that we had was this comment about even Brian Deese not wanting to mention the world industrial policy because it was unmentionable. I don't remember exactly what they said about it. That the only economist that he referred to was Danny Roderick of Harvard,
Right.
has criticized, well, globalization and questioned how, what is he has a book, The Globalization Paradox of Democracy and the Future of the World Economy, something like that.
Right.
He might have been an undergraduate with you, Bill, at Princeton.
I didn't hang around with smart people like Danny Roderick.
You were getting in trouble. Okay.
I was, yeah.
Susan Payne, and then John Dowdy, and then Tim Wells.
Yeah, I think you could say that the Trump administration, when it backed the vaccine developers so strongly, was with the Operation Warp Speed, was an industrial policy, because they went to the companies and said, take this incipient research and we'll back you and we'll buy it, whether it we'll pay for your research and guarantee to buy it whether it works or not.
Right.
That's good.
And that was definitely for our security.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting comment. Yeah.
John Dowdy.
Hey, Bill. Yeah,
Hi, John.
I don't want to front run my presentation in the next few weeks on outer space, but I would say that without national leadership, I think kicked off by President Kennedy, our space program would not be where it is today. And I think that is maybe not exactly industrial policy, but it really marshaled the full power of the aerospace industry, I think, to solve some pretty incredible challenges.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tim Wells.
Well, I was going to say something similar in that besides around World War II, certainly there's been organization around NASA, NIH, DARPA, and really our economy is based upon an awful lot of basic research done that's funded fully by the government. And we would not have the economy we have without our government. And you can just compare our, 21 billion GDP economy to Russia's $1.7 trillion GDP. That's the difference in governance.
We wouldn't have the internet without it, right?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
These are all interesting comments, but Bill, I just want to make the observation. I don't know if you're hearing what I'm hearing, that with the exception of Tim, who was really relating it to the economy, all of the contributions had a security angle. So there's this sort of connection between the security interests of the state and national security policy with industrial policy. And I think to a certain extent, that was also the genesis of the space race, right? I mean, that was Sputnik.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that Tim also brought in the economic engine piece of it. So
yeah, absolutely.
Very interesting. See, we're already off to a fascinating
I
start.
think it's good. You guys are good. I wondered what we were going to talk about tonight. You've helped me out. No, those are all very interesting comments. And, again, if it's the definition that I've used is a concentrated government directed application of resources to a specific economic sector. And generally speaking, the idea being that that particular application would result in greater economic growth and also national security, which I think has been a big driver of our industrial policy all along. And Lila, I go back to, was it Lila? I think you made the comment where he did not want, Brian Deese, and I'll talk more about him later, did not want to use the term industrial policy. I wondered exactly why, and I wasn't really too sure because I did read a presentation he gave to the Atlantic Council on Biden's program. He refused to use the term industrial policy. He did mention, though, industrial strategy.
Yeah.
Now, isn't that, I thought that was an interesting choice of words, and it led me to think, well, strategy is a highfalutin word, you know, with all kinds of important implications, and it also implies maybe something even more active than policy. Policy might be something you write down, right? Strategy implies you're going to do something. So maybe that's one of the reasons he thought strategy was a better choice of words. I'm not really sure.
Maybe he thought the business community would be more comfortable with that word.
That could be, right. That absolutely could be. Yeah. And I see Landis, you got your hand up.
Landis has got his
Yeah.
hand up again.
Yeah.
I was a doctoral student in industrial economics in the 70s, and we didn't like the term industrial policy either. And because at that time it gave an aura of central planning as opposed to, you know,
Right.
markets. Now, obviously,
Yeah, interesting.
many examples given of government policy in particular sectors.
Yeah.
As an overall strategy of economic development, industrial policy was taboo. You know.
That's interesting, Landis. I hadn't heard that before, but that's a very interesting comment. Bob?
Let's see, my point would be that I think from the conservative standpoint, the advantage of our society is that most of the basic decisions are made on a laissez-faire basis, where governments do not make the best decisions. So I think, would we not agree that the majority of our industry is private enterprise? But the government, and the debate, of course, among us all is how much government, how much private industry, and so on. But I think the advantage of our society is that we are more creative than a directed government can be. China, of course, being the questionable other example. We'll see how that works out.
Yeah.
I think Tim Wells had his hand up again.
Yeah, well, when you brought up the point about not using strategy, I instantly thought about the central planning piece because of the sensitivity to that. But the other piece is that it's a combination of government with a laissez-faire piece, because just working in large corporations, they will not take the risk of basic research. I mean, our pharmaceutical industry, the healthcare industry, all the innovation in the technology industry, that's all because of our government. And it wouldn't, without that basic research, and of course, there's decisions being made at government levels about where to place those grants and what institutions where those should be developed, that I think Americans miss how important that is to the strength of our economy, which is our national security, right?
Yeah.
It's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting comment, Tim. Yeah.
Susan and then Daniel Glover.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the comment about free enterprise from Bob, because I think if we look at the attempts to develop renewable energy and the attempts to have a government program to put subsidies to support wind power and solar power, that's run into some resistance, but it's revealed to me, at least, the incredible amounts of subsidies that the government is giving to the oil industry. So I think that it looks like we have free enterprise, but I think there's a lot going on under the surface that sways our activity in one direction or another.
Right.
Daniel Glover. Oops, Daniel, you're muted. Dan, you gotta unmute.
I sounded good to myself, actually. It seemed to me that we sound like the government has been the engine of success, where I would suggest that if we look at the communist system as it has failed, that a government, if you would call that to the extreme, doesn't really work effectively well. And the economy, back in 1776, the economy was X, and I think the government was 1/10 of X or something like that. And the government has grown to be so big and so interfering with whatever might go on, that it seems to have talked its way into thinking that it's actually creating stuff. And I read recently that, you know, the creation, what's going to happen in the future, the creativity is going to be a surprise to us, not something that we plan. All creativity is a surprise to us because we didn't know about it until it was created. We didn't know what the future was going to be until the future got here. So the suggestion that government is the answer to the question seems to me, I guess, and I don't agree with everything that Reagan said, but I would agree with that the government is more the problem than the answer. But you know, just for that, what it's worth.
Bob Ashton?
Okay, I think we would all be surprised how much research private industry does. Now, how you define research versus investment in products and so on is difficult. And there's no question that only the government can afford to do some of the really super basic research, but there's some exceptions to that. It's my understanding that Bill Gates has invested in a new design of nuclear energy. And I can make a case that is a better investment than wind and solar. Now, it's a long, complex thing, but the major investment in wind and solar has some real negatives to it. Just the mining for the components. And that's going to have a major impact on international affairs, because we can't supply what we need in those things from when we can find domestically. So it's a complex question.
It's a really interesting discussion, and really you're going down to some really core issues. What is the role of government? What is the role of private enterprise? How do the two work together to give us a successful society? I think those are really core discussions. And I would just have one comment from reading by Brian Deese. He's the head of the National Economic Council. And when he was talking to the Atlantic Council, his view of government's role was to fix things that the market does not fix and to create conditions for success. And conditions for success might be infrastructure that a particular industry, for example, would not invest in because the return to that particular operation, industry or whatever it may be, may not be very good. In other words, you have a project that you want to do that has a wide impact on the society as a whole, but does not contribute to the profit of any particular enterprise. So there's a role for government in doing that kind of thing that private industry, the way it's, the way we run it in the United States, would not have the economic interest in taking that issue on. So it's interesting, though, those are core issues about what is the role of government. So what I'd like to do now is, since I've asked that question and you've provided me some very thought-provoking answers, and obviously we don't all agree, I'd like to share the screen again and run through a little quick history program about what we have done in terms of the government's industrial policy, if I can even call it that. Well, it's industrial strategy, whatever is the right choice of terms. So there's my slide again. based on our discussion, we've hit some of these areas already, but you've really answered some of the questions. Have we ever had an industrial policy? And I would say the answer is yes. And it's been somewhat fragmented. You know, it's sometimes on specific, very specific industries, for example, and sometimes it's on a broader scope of things that are related to infrastructure that allows our society and our economy to work more smoothly. But if you go back in history and you think about, well, where have we been? I'm going to try to flip this slide here. I'm looking for I don't seem to have, oh, there we go. I got it. So has the United States ever had an industrial policy? Well, yeah. And this is one of the biggest by far. And somebody already mentioned World War II, but we obviously put an awful lot of emphasis on our industrial policy at this point. The United States went into World War II with one of the smallest militaries in the world and came out with obviously the largest. But if you look at where the money went and where the direction came from, it was literally the government. The government really took over, even though you had a lot of expertise from the private sector contributing to this. The government literally took over industrial plants and actually produced armament, for example. So there's a B-24 assembly line in California. And down here in the lower left here is the picture of the shipyard at South Portland.
Right, Liberty Ship.
Isn't that a great story? I mean, it's so exciting.
Yeah, it is.
260 ships, Liberty ships, were built right over there in South Portland. So that's what the yard looked like in 1943, is they're producing Liberty ships, which is really interesting. When I moved into my house here on Peaks Island, and I was working on a wall in the bathroom downstairs, and I uncovered there was a kind of a facade over the wall I took down, and underneath that facade was newspapers from the 1940s. The entire wall was covered with newspapers from the ship, with stories from the shipyard. You know, shipyard launches 3 Liberty ships today. It was incredible. It was absolutely incredible. So somebody who lived in my house probably worked at the shipyard. But anyway, national security, the military, we devote a huge amount of resources to that entire industrial sector. And it's for the reasons, as you might guess, of national security. Although if you look at it from a political standpoint, if you talk to politicians, they absolutely love the job features of national security. But anyway, this is the shipyard in South Portland, a B-24 plant in California. And then over here is the BIW. This is a destroyer, 2 destroyers from Bath Iron Works. Again, a major part of our industrial policy, if I can describe it as that.
And look at all the worker housing that was developed in Bath for BIW.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yep, tons of worker housing, indeed. Yep. So a lot of money obviously is going to now, and obviously did go certainly in World War II to national security and military. And then again, we've done a lot in the infrastructure area. And these are areas where the government in particular is a powerful player, because typically no one particular industry is going to expend the money, because the rate of return is so relatively small. The rate of return on an infrastructure project can be very diffuse, but it affects the entire country. But if you look on the left, that's the Erie Canal, which ran from Buffalo to Albany, finished in 1825, 360 miles of waterway, which was a New York State project, by the way. It wasn't even a federal government project. And there in the center is the meeting in Utah, the meeting of the 2 lines, the Union Pacific and the, what was the other one? Central Pacific. I'm trying to remember the names of the railroads now, but they met in Utah, Provo, Utah, and celebrated the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. And then on the right side is, which we've already mentioned, by the way, FDR and his programs, but here you have a massive infrastructure project, the Hoover Dam, which is out there in Nevada, which is a giant project generating, it's for water, for purposes of managing water from Colorado River, but also generating electricity. Another major infrastructure project was part of our industrial policy, it's interesting to note that in the particular case of FDR and in thinking about his industrial policy, this was literally to save the country. So it's a little bit different from an industrial policy like building a transcontinental railroad. It's something that was done to save the country during the Depression, where a lot of money was spent on government projects. There were large projects like this one, sometimes small projects like painting the inside of a building, literally, and were literally done to save the economy of the country at the time. And again, infrastructure projects, as you all know, the famous interstate highway system launched by President Eisenhower in the 1950s. This again was a huge infrastructure project for us. And certainly if you look at it from an industrial policy standpoint, a very important development. And then you've already mentioned medicine and public health. Somebody mentioned the vaccines, which I think are a fine example of this. And on the left, there's a picture of Martins Point, which is the Martins Point Marine Hospital, built in 1858. And again, this was very interesting policy by the United States to shore up commerce, seaborne commerce, because sailors really had nowhere to go for their health care in the merchant marine. And in 1797, the Congress passed an act that allowed the creation of marine hospitals, which were there to take care of the sailors in our commercial marine service. And Martins Point was created in Portland because Portland was a major seaport in 1858. And it became the Marine Hospital for the city of Portland, part of the Marine Hospital system, which had hospitals located all over, up and down the East Coast at major ports, and also had some out in the Midwest or the Great Lakes as well. But the very important part of that, by the way, the Marine Hospital eventually became a public health service hospital, and so then it was purchased by Martins Point Healthcare in 1982. But again, part of the history of medicine and public health as being an industrial policy for the United States. It's interesting how many examples of this, by the way, you can find in the Portland area. It's not like you don't really have to go very far to find examples of government work in the, if I could call it, the industrial sphere. And then again, if you go to Bethesda, Maryland, the picture on the right there's the National Institutes of Health. Certainly a major project for the US government is related to public health and also to actual medicine and healthcare. And then again, this is kind of interesting, but automotive production has been a strong policy of the United States for a long time. And I could say one clear example of that was when President Obama literally rescued the automobile industry of the United States after the 2008 financial crash, right? All of a sudden you've got GM, which is literally going broke and is being virtually purchased by the United States government. And now that money was paid back, isn't that nice? But the US government was basically taking over automobile production at that time. And that was done to save the economy. So we're looking at, an economic gain that we might have lost if we hadn't taken that action. And then again, you guys have all mentioned this, but technology, energy, and space have all been very important part of our industrial policy. Again, I'm not sure that all these things that I'm talking about have been well coordinated, or they haven't really been part of a single package. For the most part, they've been responses to situations where you see a need and the government steps in to try to take care of that need, to try to fulfill the need. But here you've got a picture up in the top there of the Salton Sea in California, where geothermal plants are being developed to generate electricity, but also that little headline you see underneath it, enough lithium to far exceed today's US demand. Lithium is a critical element in so many things, including battery production. So now the government is leading an effort to figure out how can we produce more lithium domestically. We have no shortage of lithium in the United States. In fact, there's an interest in an area outside of Lewiston for lithium production here in Maine. So the problem is, like so many other things in our economy, we've turned them over to other countries to do for us. But there's the Salton Sea and a geothermal plant out there. And then again, you've already mentioned oil. Oil is in particular, oil has been a favorite industry for the longest time, and we've granted great uses of public land for oil drilling, right? Oil extraction. Much public land has been devoted to that cause. And in addition to that, we have had even though they've had charged oil companies a fee for doing that, for drilling on public land, that fee has not been raised since 1920. So the drilling fee for a private company to come drill on public land has been the same for 100 years. And it was just, Biden just changed it. Just changed. I think he increased it by fourfold for drilling on public land, but that's obviously supporting an industry. And then of course you mentioned space as a huge part of our industrial policy, a deliberate, especially by Kennedy, to move the United States into the absolute lead in space exploration and travel, obviously a moonshot. And then agriculture. The United States has an enormous amount of subsidy going to agriculture, and that is to support that particular aspect of our economy. This picture, by the way, is upstate New York on a trip that I was on my way to Watertown, New York, which is up in the northwest part of the state. And I just stopped the car and got out and took a picture with my camera because everything looks so pretty. But that's a huge amount of subsidy for agriculture. And then, of course, education. The United States government has a huge investment in education, and we do that for a whole bunch of things. But one of the most striking and most successful, I think, was the land grant colleges. So there's a map showing the land grant colleges as they came in during the 1860s until the 1890s was when the land grant colleges appeared. So again, another example of U.S. industrial policy, perhaps not as a package, but more or less responding to needs as they arose. And any comments so far before I launch into Mr. Dees? I think we covered most of those things, but again, it shows if nothing else, it shows I think, again, thinking about Bob's comments and others, I think, again, it shows the critical nature of the US government's role, even though, again, our economy is largely private driven and it responds basically to market needs. I think it does show the critical role the government has played in so many spheres and continues to play today. And I see a hand was up. Yes.
I just wanted to add to the list of subsidies, and that for corn, for ethanol. And I see that it's going to be raised again so that you could sell 15%, I think, ethanol now.
Right.
My little lawnmower says no more than 10%. And so it has a trickle-down effect on small engines with the corrosion that the ethanol,
right,
soluble, of course, provides.
Absolutely. And others, Bob, were you going to comment?
Well, yeah, I'm fascinated with your bringing up the lithium issue, but that's not the only one. There's a lot of ingredients that we get all over the world. Lithium may be one of the large ones. Now, your knowledge vastly exceeds mine. Where are they going? Are they trying to find it within the United States, or are they trying to lock in sources around the world?
When I get to Brian Dees, you'll see that they're looking in the US. One of the main things is to get away from supply chains and the problems that supply chains have shown us in the last 2 or 3 years, and to do much more domestic production of what they call critical minerals and materials. That's the focus of the government right now. Tim?
Well, also the Human Genome Project, which has paid for itself in spades, right?
Yeah.
Very critical. Again, a private company never would have taken that on. Or been able to do that. And again, if you look at any of our major telecom sector, our computer, our technology sectors, satellites, all the rocketry. We've taken that, developed it, and handed over to private companies.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just, it's amazing what we've done. Yeah.
I completely agree with you, Tim. And if I may nudge my way in here, Bill, I'm glad you got
Please
the
nudge.
Yeah, I'm trying to push my way in here among the gentlemen and get back to a point that Susan made. Well, let's make explicit the role of universities and basic research in this. And as Tim has pointed out, and is written about so eloquently by Walter Isaacson in his recent book called The Code Breaker, which is about primarily Jennifer Doudna and CRISPR, but in fact, time after time, he shows that the breakthroughs, whether in genome, the unraveling of the genome, or the development of CRISPR, would never have happened unless there had been that accidental kind of support that comes out of supporting basic research, where the researcher, whether at Harvard or Stanford or out somewhere on a beach in Spain, is just fascinated by a topic they want to pursue. And that the government grants have played a very important role when they've done it well, and where they have stopped basic research when they cut back on those grants. And so universities today, so many of them have really developed links into the research world, which forms a triangle with private companies, other researchers, government. It's we wouldn't have had, as Susan said, the whole development that happened with warp speed, or with others that didn't benefit from warp speed, if there hadn't been that kind of triangular relationship going.
Yeah, and it's true. It is interesting. All the those kinds of interactions that occur. And I remember as an officer in the Air Force in the 1970s in Southern California, seeing the growth of the military and space complex that was going on in Southern California, and as far north as San Francisco area as well.
Right, and the digital world and the internet, which was a military development, but it wouldn't have happened without basic mathematical research from people like Johnny von Neumann.
Yeah, it was interesting to see how that really did change into Silicon Valley. Susan?
Yeah, I want to just tie back to our discussion about population last week. There are three things I can think of. One is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was the Roosevelt program that really bolstered the Southeast US and its economy. One is the Homestead Act that Lincoln promulgated, which resulted in the settling of the plains. And then I think you could say that a lot of our immigration policy is motivated by, say, the desire to bring in skilled labor or unskilled labor. Yeah.
And should still be. I'll be quiet.
Atlantis? Yeah.
Going back to the very fundamentals, I think you could generalize by saying that if a market would work, we would trust the market. If it doesn't work, if there are reasons for markets to fail, then you would look toward collective action, some sort of government policy, if you will. And one of the most fundamental reasons why markets don't work is in the production of public goods. That is, goods that are, if available to one person, there's no way of excluding non-payers. There's no way to have a market work for that. And basic research is one of the most obvious cases of a public good. So in a lot of the things, the examples that have been raised, they are examples where markets wouldn't work because it's production of knowledge, the public good.
Yeah, thanks, Landis. And Tim?
Well, I forgot my main point, but I worked for GE Advanced Materials, and when I just all the chemistry pieces and the basic research there. I mean, silicone came about because of World War II, although it came about afterwards, because we needed it for missiles, we needed it for aircraft, we needed it for all these military purposes, and it built this huge industry. you know, which in PCP was developed by GE for World War because of the war effort, which wasn't great, but it served a purpose for our electrical transmission grid. I mean, the Rural Electrification Act. Again, I mean, obviously, it's the combination of the private industry with the government that's so powerful. But again, it's what we've driven around the world, and for other governments also, and what European governments have done is really the basis of the world economy. And it's tremendous.
Yeah. So I'm gonna share my screen again and then get into some of the proposals from the Biden administration. And there is Brian Deese. Brian Deese is the head of the National Economic Council. And as I already said to you guys, he likes the term industrial strategy. So as opposed to industrial policy. And here's where he says the core pillars of this strategy are you ready? Supply chain resiliency. So we've learned a lot. I remember when I did supply chains for great decisions, I'm thinking, oh my, supply chains. Turns out that's pretty interesting. When you think about it, where do things come from? It's very interesting. And supply chain resiliency is critically important to the country. Public investment, that means public money in particular, so public resources are going to go into some target of the government related to industrial strategy. So it's going to be some public money that goes in here. It's not all going to be private money. Public procurement, what does that mean? That means that products that come from our industries that are produced through this industrial strategy are going to be purchased by the government. So if the government needs something, the government is going to first look inside our own borders for that particular product and preferably make a purchase of that product, which is made in the United States by American workers. So that has some interesting implications for it. Climate resiliency. So again, they are considering what are they doing in industrial strategy that relates to climate change. That's an important element of their consideration. Some of the things I find that with Biden's industrial strategy sometimes support that objective. Sometimes they seem a bit in conflict with it, which is interesting. And then equity. Brian Deese emphasized over and over again that the kind of economy that we've created, and in particular in the last 30, 40 years, has really led to great inequalities of income and wealth in the United States, such as we haven't experienced for 100 years. So they're looking at making sure that wealth is more evenly distributed in any kind of industrial strategy that they undertake, that, labor has a bigger component in terms of the resources generated and the pay that's provided, the rewards that are provided, that labor is a bigger part of that. And that what they call, the term is underrepresented portions of our society benefit from this industrial strategy. So there are the core pillars: supply chain resiliency, public investment, public procurement, climate resiliency, and equity. And there's more. As soon as I get to the button that changes the slide. Okay, so here it is. These, now that you could read this in if you read the Great Decisions book and you read the chapter on industrial policy, these are the critical industries that Biden's industrial strategy is paying attention to. Semiconductors. So semiconductors seem to go into everything today. They're crucial for almost every product that's produced, except maybe your dinnerware. Well, I'm sure the production is partly handled by semiconductors, but they're just ubiquitous. So semiconductors is a key industry. The United States produces a vast amount of, actually imports a vast amount of its semiconductor demand from other countries, in particular from China and Taiwan. The United States is a really relatively small producer of semiconductors today, And the Biden administration wants to change that. The picture there on the right is a picture of a new Intel plant for semiconductors going in Chandler, Arizona. Intel is making huge investments in new plant, modernizing plants because the United States was not producing the most sophisticated semiconductors. Taiwan is. Critical minerals, we mentioned that briefly. We mentioned materials like lithium, for example, cobalt. There are a bunch of critical minerals that are essential to a modern economy. And in particular, they support things like the semiconductor industry, right? You have to have these critical minerals. So there's quite an effort to develop to improve and raise the domestic capability to produce critical minerals. Pharmaceuticals. So much of our medicines now come from overseas. So the Biden administration would like to change that to some degree to produce more pharmaceuticals within our own borders. And then batteries, in particular, the high capacity, high storage batteries that would be so essential to things like, well, just energy storage in buildings and houses and automobiles. Critical to have batteries if you're going to switch to an electrified transportation system, domestic electrification, things like that. You're going to have batteries to do that. So those are the 4 key industries. This is where the government wants to invest some money. Right now, the government is proposing, Biden administration is proposing a $52 billion program just related to the production of semiconductors. That means $52 billion of US government subsidy to the manufacturers of semiconductors. The 2021 Infrastructure and Jobs Act, that was already passed. That was the one thing the Biden administration got through, right? A $1.5 trillion plan stretched out over years, which is focused on clean energy. And clean energy depends very much on the key industries like semiconductors and critical minerals and high-speed broadband. So raising the communications capability of our communities. And then the expenditure of the 4 key industries. And by the way, it gets a little fuzzy here, but when I'm looking at these 4 key industries, I kept thinking, is this the Build Back Better Act that we heard so much about? And I think the answer is yes, but it was a little hard to pin down. And I think the Chait article was a little clearer on this. This industrial strategy really was partly built into the Infrastructure Act, which is already passed, but mostly was built into the Build Back Better program, which has not had any success in Congress so far. And that program involves the expenditure of hundreds of billions of dollars, as Brian Deese describes it, over 8 to 10 years. And he describes that as not a big amount of money because it's only 1% of our GDP every year. So we'll see. And then again, another feature of this industrial strategy is public-private collaboration. A great example of that is semiconductors. The US is going to provide some economic resources for production of semiconductors within the United States, but the US government is not going to produce them. A private company is going to produce them. So that is the real very short, I got to admit, this is a very short version of the Biden industrial strategy. But then I'd like to have you guys talk about some questions that I have as a result of that. So my first question, and please write these down so you remember them. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have to remember. I have them written down. The first question I have is, what's the rationale behind this strategy? Why does the Biden administration now think it needs an industrial strategy that includes, for example, those 4 key industries? What is their rationale? What is their thinking? And then the next question I've got is, what is the likelihood of implementing? So how good a chance do these policies stand? I already mentioned the Build Back Better has not really made any progress in Congress. So what's the likelihood, given our domestic politics and our current economic situation, because I think that's a player as well, of this kind of a program, this industrial strategy actually being implemented, actually being carried out? And then the third question, which I think is really important to us all, what are the possible consequences of implementing this program? So those are some good questions for you. And let me go back to the very first one. What's the rationale behind this strategy? So I'm looking for comments. What are we thinking? Tim? Yeah.
Well, I would say we're thinking about a whole bunch of different things, but one is with semiconductors. First, we're incredibly vulnerable from just from a commercial technological point of view. We lead in innovation, but and a lot of designs come from the United States, but the manufacturing actually is happening overseas.
Yeah, right.
But even our military hardware, we don't make a lot of the chips that a lot of our platforms require. They're all made overseas.
Right. Yeah.
So if we get into a prolonged conflict and China takes over Taiwan and stops Korea from shipping and Singapore from shipping chips to us, we're in a bind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Pharmaceuticals, same thing. We're at a huge. I really can't believe we ever got here. That we weren't paying attention. That we took our eye off the ball so badly in terms of some of these things that we put ourselves in a very vulnerable position. And that it took COVID to recognize it shows how what's happening within our government has really harmed our national security, our economic prosperity. Really has put us at a huge disadvantage. And we're, from all my business experience around the world, we are what takes us 10 years to do. A lot of the parts of the world do it in a year or two. We are getting lapped, and it is putting us, everything at risk, our form of governance, our leadership in the world, and whether we lead economically and whether we lead the world, educationally, in research, all kinds of ways. But, and so I think some of this stuff came as a jolt. Unfortunately, Congress doesn't seem to be able to do much. And because it seems to be the strategy of one party to win at any cost and not look out for the country, but look out for holding, to gain more power. And we'll see what happens, but I'm very concerned about where we are today, because these are things that in the past, they're nonpartisan issues. They're about, are we a team? Are we Americans? Do we care about our country? And they're real no-brainers. And hopefully we come together before it's too late.
Well, thanks, Tim. Other comments?
I couldn't agree more with Tim. It's absolutely critical to our national security, all of those areas, and he's summarized each one of them very, very well. And we're very fortunate that we do have some of those critical minerals within the boundaries of the United States, if we turn our minds to them. The whole question of Build Back Better, your second question, or the part of it, can this ever go anywhere? Elizabeth Warren wrote a very interesting opinion piece that appeared today in the New York Times. And basically, she's focusing just on that. Get this done, or else we're up a creek, basically, not just as the Democratic Party, but the U.S. is. And if you haven't read it, I suggest you read it. My last point, Bill, is I'd like to put a plug in here for Brian Deese with his Maine connections. Don't know if all of you know about it, but his sister is Heather Deese, and she is a remarkable person who led the Island Institute in its work on marine resources, on climate resiliency, and on alternative energy.
Wow, interesting.
So mark her as someone you really ought to get to know. She's
Heather
an
Deese, okay.
outstanding woman.
Allison, make a note. You may already know her. We got it. Well, that's a great, maybe it's an angle to get Brian to come up and talk to the World Affairs Council of Maine.
Well, I think you
Very
better get Heather to talk with you first and then bring in
And
Brian.
we don't want to overlook Heather. That's right. That's a good point.
Bill Landis has got his hand up too.
Yes, Landis, yeah.
Yeah, what I'm going to say, I don't think is a main point behind the policy, but maybe it's worth note that one of the theorems of international trade is the trade between a capital-intensive country like the United States and labor-intensive countries to reduce the wage rates in the capital-intensive country.
Yeah, right.
And you
Right.
reverse that, and it might serve the interests of higher wages.
Yeah,
I doubt that that's a principal issue, but
right.
out there anyway.
Mhm. Well, I'll just mention some other things that I got out of reading Brian Deese address to the Atlantic Council. One is the administration rejects neoliberalism. So that's an interesting change. Neoliberalism has dominated American thought, which is really market-dominated economics, right? Government has a minimal role. It's very constrained, and the market dominates, just as Bob describes it, the market dominates, the private market dominates the economy. But he, I think, rejects it, and he criticizes neoliberal thinking for hollowing out American manufacturing and the growing wealth and income inequality in the United States and the dependence on others for critical supplies. So that's one of the comments that you get from reading Brian Dee's proposal. And of course, everyone knows this, but the pandemic, it showed the vulnerability of supply chains, right? Goods suddenly stopped coming. And even today, we're still bearing the consequences of the disruption in the global supply chains that occurred during the pandemic. And then a big factor in all of this, I think, again, I see this over and over again, is China. And Brian Deese very flatly says China and others, he doesn't mean just China, but he means other countries as well, are not playing by, they're playing by a different set of rules from the United States. So the United States, light touch of government, market domination, et cetera, et cetera. That's not how other countries are playing. Korea really is a big supporter of the shipbuilding industry. Japan, automobile production, consumer electronics. Those were all features of government direction. They didn't just happen by accident. So again, he thinks that we need to be rethinking some of our philosophy about how an economy actually works and what is the role of government in that. And then he frankly admits that China presents a strategic threat to the United States. And there's a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs from a guy named John Mearsheimer. John is a writer on foreign affairs, and he is a realist.
An offensive realist.
Really, yes, indeed.
Offensive neo-realist,
Yes,
not
he
to
is.
be confused with defensive neo-realism.
No, he is.
Or
Yeah,
classical realism.
Right.
Don't get me going.
John is quite something. He has rather strong views. I'll read this little paragraph from his writing in the Foreign Affairs article. This is Foreign Affairs of December 2021. Once China grew wealthy, the US-Chinese Cold War was inevitable. This is a realist thinking, clearly. Engagement may have been the worst strategic blunder any country has made in recent history. Engagement, even the United States made a huge, engaging with China for the United States was a huge mistake. That's what he's saying. There is no comparable example of a great power, meaning the United States, actively fostering the rise of a peer competitor, meaning China. And it is now too late to do much about it. Wow, that's depressing. But I had to read that to you. I mean, that's very interesting thinking on Mearsheimer's part. And to some extent, I think that penetrates the Biden administration. I think they're thinking of what are the costs of engaging with China? And they think the United States is paying some costs. And another comment that Dees makes over and over again is that economic strength is the core of our foreign policy. So you've got to have a strong economy, to have a strong foreign policy, to have a strong national defense, et cetera. And individual businesses and industries lack the financial incentive for broad-based long-term investments. And in that role, government has to lead. So that's some of the thinking behind the Biden administration as far as their approach to industrial strategy is concerned. And if I go back to another
Oh, wait,
slide.
Norm Olson had his hand up.
Norm, go ahead, Norm. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to point out that I know John Mearsheimer fairly well, and I agree with him on a lot of things, but it's really unfair to say that engagement was a mistake because there was really no way to proceed by locking out 1.3 billion people in the global economy when they want to know. I think the difference would be, I was in Geneva during the WTO talks for 4 years, and we were at the US mission to the United Nations. So we were just up the street from the USTR office, US Trade Rep office, within the WTO for pushing Chinese secession. And I have to say that it was even then an exercise in naivete for those of us looking at it, because it wasn't just the USTR reps under Clinton who were saying, we got to get China in, we got to do it, we got to bend.
Right.
American industry driving the train.
Right, exactly.
And we had untold industrial commercial representatives come through, and they would brief our ambassador as well as USTR. And they had stars in their eyes. It was going to be this huge export market that we were going to tap. All those Chinese were going to be buying American goods. And those of us not directly engaged in the thing were saying, are you guys out of your minds? You're going to deal with this command economy like it's a whole bunch of independent consumers desperate for American junk. So anyway, it was, so I disagree with John Mearsheimer a little bit on this. Engagement was inevitable. Naivete didn't have to be the process.
That's a very, very interesting comment, Norm. And I actually do agree with those. So the next question I wanted to get you guys to think about was, bring my my slide changer back up here, was given domestic politics and current economic situation, what is the likelihood of actually implementing something from this industrial strategy? I think we've partly answered that question.
I would say very slim.
Yep. Norm? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, going back to one of your earlier slides, you had 5 points that Dees was talking about. Two of those points are longstanding. They're practically the United States, which is government procurement and government investment. And there will always be unanimity in Congress about that. It's the other three that are new, and those are the questionable ones for eventual implementation. The climate cognizance of some kind, and I forget the other one. So those other three basically, I would say, tend to address income inequality and externalization of cost by private industry, which has frankly been a key unwritten policy of the United States, is to allow industry and commerce to externalize their costs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The other issue of letting labor have a larger or fairer share of the portion.
Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of the
Susan, did I lose you?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, they brought back the earmarks. So I wonder if there's some way they could strategize on this and get the congressional people to vote because they're putting projects in their districts.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Play hardball.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Every time BIW is mentioned, Susan Collins and Senator King go crazy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, it's true. That could certainly have an influence. My own thinking on this is I think it's going to be tough for the Democrats to get much through. I think it's gotten tougher as the years gone on. I think the 2022 elections could really change the Congress over to complete Republican dominance. I mean, there's a good chance that might happen. And then it'll be very difficult to get these kinds of programs through. However, I think, Susan, you bring up an interesting point where it is in the interest of the congressional representative, whoever that may be, there can be pieces of it that can be implemented. So,
Right.
and regardless of whether that's a Republican or a Democrat or an independent in a district, there may be some benefits to that district in terms of employment, wealth, productive enterprise that would be too hard to say no to. And there may be pieces of the plan that would be able to be implemented. If the entire package can't go through, at least elements of it can.
Bill, if you look at the opinion piece that Elizabeth Warren wrote today or had published today in the New York Times, you will see, in addition to what you've mentioned, she also lists things that Biden could do by an executive decision.
Yeah, good. Yeah, good. That's a really good point. Yeah. So let me move on to the third. And I'm Norm. Yes, go ahead, Norm.
Sorry, I just wanted to make one more point. That missing from the, 4 industrial areas, I thought was one that exemplified their gauging of a bridge too far. And that missing element was healthcare.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
It's itself a huge industry.
It is it's gigantic, a huge proportion of our economy.
Right.
It's pushing close to 20%, which is amazing. I mean, it's the upper teens right now, but almost 20% of the economy now is related to healthcare, medicine, healthcare, medical research. So it's really amazing how big a player that is.
I think Tim Wells has his hand up again.
Oh, Tim, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. The healthcare thing I also was thinking of, because it's our healthcare industry is the size of Germany's whole GDP. Just our healthcare.
Right.
$4 trillion. It is 20% of our GDP. Yeah. And that's not including the other externalities that drives.
Yeah.
And so it's making us globally uncompetitive, the cost of healthcare.
That's an interesting point, Tim.
We have to address it to stay it's unsustainable where we're at now.
Yeah.
And if we paid what the UK pays on a per capita basis, we would save $2.2 trillion a year, which is the size of the 7th or 8th largest economy. It's the size of Brazil's total economy. That's what we could save. And if we could redeploy that, because of global warming, all the infrastructure we're going to have to replace, think of what we could do with that $2 trillion.
Right. Yeah.
And redeploy that. And it would increase employment, it would increase wages, it would increase innovation across our whole economy. It would be tremendous. I mean, there's nothing we could do that would secure our national security and grow our economy and strengthen our nation than tackle our healthcare.
Interesting comment, Tim. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the third one, which is I went back one too far. What are the possible consequences of actually implementing this plan? I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Well, Susan had her hand up, but I think Tim was starting to get to the consequences.
No, I was just going to say, I'm a healthcare researcher, and the last I looked, we were 37th in the world, in the United States, in the healthcare quality. So when we talk about covering more people and saving money, we can do that and raise our quality. I just wanted to insert that. Yeah. So it's not that we're first in the world and we're going to jeopardize that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the consequences then would be.
Any thoughts on the consequences of actually doing these things?
Well, it sounds like what Tim and Susan were saying is that one of the consequences would be improved healthcare and an additional several $1 trillion to deploy into research and development and rising wages.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
But I think there are other consequences, maybe not all so positive. I mean, it's important to hear from people. So What do other people have to say?
Other thoughts? Okay, I will help lead in. I will just think about some of the things I wrote down when I was thinking about what are the possible consequences. And I wrote it down in two, one is benefits and the other is risk. There's always benefits and costs, right, to every calculation. And I think the benefits potential, I would always say these are potential, right? These are potential benefits, is the reduced overseas dependence. So that's a potential benefit. Has some cost to it too, though, by the way. A better position for labor, a better economic position for labor. Improved key infrastructure. So key parts of our infrastructure, like broadband, for example. Very important that we improve broadband. That is essential to the way work is done today, is high speed, high capacity broadband. It's absolutely essential. The development and dispersion of new technologies, so more electrification, for example, new technologies for production of energy. And I believe, Bob, you already mentioned nuclear, new ways of doing nuclear plants, for example. Perhaps better health. I think that's up for that's a question, but perhaps it will be, because there are investments in healthcare that are being provided as part of that. More effective steps against climate change, we hope. I think some of the things I'm seeing in the plan take me in the other direction. And then decarbonization, which of course relates to climate change, using less fossil fuel in our production of goods and our transportation and so forth, in general throughout the economy. So those are the benefits. The risks of this always fascinate me. The risks are so fascinating. So if you're trying to build an economy where the government is more of a player, where the government has big bucks to pass around, right? There are risks involved in that. And when you're building an economy where now it's, and even Brian Deese used this expression, buy American, you're baking in some risks to that effort. And the risks are that if you protect one industry, and Trump's example of steel tariffs was a beautiful example of this, you hurt another, because they're downstream industries that depend on steel that are in the United States that are producing steel products. And suddenly the product, steel and aluminum in Trump's case, become much more expensive to them. So you can actually have a positive impact on employment and earnings in the steel industry and hurt another industry downstream. So it's very, very difficult calculation to make when you're trying to pursue an industrial strategy. Higher prices overall. We've already got a pretty high rate of inflation right now. Hopefully it won't last too much longer, but it's reached pretty high levels at the moment. But higher prices result from when you start to close off other sources of supply and you start to emphasize American production. And I think you can almost always expect to have higher prices in certain areas result from that. And reduced innovation. When I was out, I remember when I was out looking for a car in the 1970s for my wife and our 3 kids, there was no good American product automobile produced. They were junk. They were unreliable. They were gas hogs, and they were terrible cars in the Why? Because the American automobile industry was protected, and innovation was slow, and prices were high, and they just didn't produce a very good product. The Japanese, by producing small cars, slipped in underneath the import controls, right? And I ended up buying a Civic. It was the best car I've ever owned. And I've been a foreign car fan ever since. Well, that's what happened to the American consumer. The American consumer shifted because American products weren't meeting the need anymore, because they were protected by our own government. And then, of course, you've got the opportunities for corruption, which inevitably are the result of money, government money that's out there to be passed around. And then retaliation by other countries. So if you're going to buy American, other countries perceive that you are shutting off the market for their materials, then there's a risk of other countries retaliating. So those are risks that are built into almost every kind of economic strategy, not even Brian Deese's strategy, because any kind of economic strategy the government is looking at over time. I mean, they've shown up over and over again in our history. So I just think they're just something you have to pay attention to when you're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of our economic policy. So there's my thoughts on that. Any other thoughts on the risk at this point? Okay, I'm gonna show you one more slide, and I'm trying to get you out of here on time. So this is the, again, we to discuss some of the possible implications. And I think when you look at the proposals the Biden administration is bringing up, consider not only the good that might come from these proposals, and I think some of them are very necessary. I think there's been some underemphasis, for example, on production of things that we can produce in the United States but aren't producing them, but also consider the risks that are involved in that. I think this entire discussion is related to and affects the future of globalization. So here's a chart that shows the pattern of globalization since the early 19th century, carries it up to 2014, and I wish I could have found one that was a little more recent than that. But you'll notice the rapid growth, if I look, just concentrate on one period that occurred around the late 80s, early 90s, and then just shot up until we hit the 2008 slump, which occurred in fact worldwide actually. And then the share of GDP that relates to international trade dropped, and it picked back up again, and now it's on a downward trend. So the downward trend since the mid-2010s has been fairly obvious, and the pandemic certainly didn't help that at all. But again, I think globalization as such, the movement of people, goods, technology, et cetera, throughout the world, I think it's lost some of its shine. I don't think people are quite as fascinated with the issue of globalization, that globalization will be the future of mankind and will leave us all better off. So I think there's some real risks out there in terms of the overall world situation right now and the future of globalization. I think more and more countries are looking to what they can do internally. And I think another factor that influences my thinking is the very hugely negative impact of Russia and the fact that Russia has become such a military aggressor attacking the country next door of Ukraine. And I think that's going to have a big impact on globalization. Certainly will have an impact on Europe and how Europe organizes its security, but also will have a big impact on the thinking in the world about how much dependence do you place on other countries for critical goods. And obviously, Russia is a major supplier of oil and gas, in particular to Europe, but now to other countries as well. And Ukraine and Russia themselves, both of the countries, were produced about 30 to 40% of the worldwide wheat. So wheat production very heavily, and other grains that were produced very much in the countries of Ukraine and Russia. So what is the cost of having your dependence so high on these particular countries, or other countries for that matter? Our dependence on China is another good example of that. What are the costs that you're paying as a result of it? So it's an interesting time that we're all in. I think some of the growth that we've had in globalization is now leveling off and perhaps shrinking. My last slide, so I can send you home. Peaks Island.
Love it.
Yeah, I love it. This Peaks Island is leading the way. So when you think about infrastructure and you think about the really critical importance of communications in any kind of infrastructure projects, right? And you think about industrial strategy, communications is certainly a critical part of that. Peaks Island has now got its own British telecom communication system right here on the island. We have a direct line to the Queen where we can discuss, say, family matters with her. It's absolutely an amazing advancement. And it surely shows you, at least on Peaks Island, we're very much into industrial strategy. And even with we know there are limits to globalization, but we're still interested in globalization, as evidenced by this wonderful telephone booth. So if you're making a trip over to Peaks Island sometime, please visit our fantastic telephone booth, which we're all very proud of.
Well,
And
thank
do
you.
tell Her Majesty if she's having a tough time with her children to
Oh,
come.
those kids, I'll tell you.
Well, thank you everyone for a really engaging conversation tonight. As promised, industrial policy was a lot of fun. Very interesting. Thank you, Bill, once
Bill.
again for being with us tonight and for your effort and helping us understand this really important issue. Next week, a very boring topic that is not in the news at all, not at all interesting, Russia and the US with our own Andrea Stanley Hester.
Yeah.
So stay tuned and thank you all for being part of Great Decisions and
Yeah.
being.
Thanks, everybody. It's always so much fun to hear from you all. Thanks. Good
Good
night.
night, everybody.
Night, everyone.